Welcome to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM for Tuesday, April 8th. I'm Andrew Walworth, and I'm joined by RCP co-founder and president Tom Bevan and Washington Bureau Chief Carl Cannon. So 2 wins for Donald Trump at the Supreme Court over the past 24 hours. Today, Tuesday, the court put a pause on a lower court order that directed the administration to rehire some 16,000 probationary federal workers. And yesterday, that was Monday, the court said it was okay for Trump to use the Alien Enemies Act to rapidly deport alleged gang members. And then they put a hold on another lower court decision that was going to force the repatriation of Abrego Garcia. He's the Marylander who was deported due to a so-called administrative error. So, Tom, caveats to both of these decisions, but overall, is this a victory for Trump, and how big a victory is it?
Absolutely, it's a victory for Trump, and the Supreme Court finally engaged, and that's what, as the back and forth was going on, and we talked about this multiple times, that these lower courts were issuing these nationwide injunctions, which I guess supporters of the administration felt were judicial overreach. I talked to Sean Davis about that on this program, maybe last week before last, and it was creating this, what even the administration, I guess Pam Bondi the other day said that, look, this is, we're headed toward a constitutional crisis. And so the Supreme Court finally got involved and, again, issued temporary, basically allowing the Trump administration to continue to do this, but also, I think, wanting to get some more clarity from both sides on what the issues are at play. So definitely a win for the administration, but that's not the end of the story.
Yeah. So, Carl, were you surprised by either of these decisions, and what do you make of them?
Well, no, but the first one you mentioned was 5-4 with Amy Coney Barrett voting with the Democrats. I hate to say it that way, but that's kind of how people view the court,
Yeah.
the courts now, because all these judges that you mentioned, almost all of them, issuing, local district court judge, federal judge, but a local district court judge issuing these nationwide injunctions. Most of them are, appointees of Joe Biden, Barack Obama, and Bill Clinton. So when a judge sort of goes against the party that chose her or him, it's news these days. You don't want to get too far ahead of the story, because as Tom said, most of these are temporary. This Maryland guy, I don't see what the legal justification is for not, bringing him back. But the administration ought to want to do this on its own. And John Roberts, who's pretty good at figuring out how to keep the doctrine of separation of powers intact. Sometimes he feels like the only person in Washington who's really interested in that. I think he's nonplussed, because why doesn't the administration, why didn't Donald Trump pick up the phone and call the president of Salvador and say, hey, we made a mistake. This thing's going to end up as a federal case. And it's not a precedent I think I want. Please send him back. They've not done that, and nobody knows why. And I guess they're willing to roll the dice with the courts. But so far, so good for the Trump administration. But this is not the end of it, as Tom said. And the other thing is, I think the high court is going to have to address probably directly this idea of local judges, making sweeping international rulings. So far they've decided, they've approached on procedural grounds, but at some point the doctrine itself is going to be before the court. And my guess is that, again, the Chief Justice and his working majority is going to try and find a prerogative, find a way to keep the prerogative of the local judiciary, but without this overreach that Sean Davis talks about, because that it seems like something from the 70s, or I don't know, the 90s. Some judge in Chile or Spain would hold the American president in contempt of court. You say, what the hell's going on? We don't want to be like that. So the court's still got its work to do.
Yeah, it is. Tom, that's a good point, because these are sort of piecemeal decisions. Each one of these is slightly different, has caveats, very complicated. None of the three of us are lawyers, so that might be obvious to people. But it does seem that overall, what Carl's talking about has to happen at some point, which is we have to have some sort of decision procedurally on a sort of on a global scale of, and I suppose this has to come through the courts, although I would think maybe the Congress could get involved, but that would sort of say, hey, here's where a judge's writ begins and ends in terms of these sorts of decisions, that they can or cannot sort of get into policy at this level to change what a elected president wants to do. Things he's run on. I mean, these were all sorts of things that Trump said he was going to do, and the American people voted for.
Right, and that's why people were looking to the Supreme Court, looking to John Roberts, because again, and we've talked about this before, separation of powers, right? Articles 1, 2, and 3. The judiciary is the sort of weakest of the three, and they rely solely on the moral authority of the court, right? And if they lose faith in the system, if they lose faith that the judiciary has become politicized and is partisan to the point now where it's not liberal and conservative judges, as Carl says, it's now Democrats and Republicans, and elected officials just decide they're not going to obey. If the court loses that moral authority, then we're in big trouble as a country. And so it's in John Roberts's interest, I think, to try and fashion some sort of doctrine that puts the lower courts sort of in their place so that they're not engaged in this constant overreach. And again, this is all essentially unique to Trump, right? And we've talked about the numbers before. The number of injunctions that Trump has just in the last 2 months, the number that over the last 9 years. I mean, these are, it did happen to Biden during his 4 years, but the vast majority of the cases that we're talking about were all lower courts stepping in and issuing nationwide injunctions against the Trump administration and their policies. As with a lot of things, it's probably not a good plan to just hope that when Trump leaves the scene that this is all going to revert to normal, some sort of, go back to the way it was, because I don't think that's the case. We don't just want to put our faith that the toothpaste is going to go back in the tube, because it's most likely not going to. So we are going to need some clarity.
Andy,
But so far,
Andy, I want to get back to a point you made, though, Andy. Donald Trump did run on this. He's not doing anything tariffs. No, you know what? He's not doing anything he didn't run on. He mentioned all this stuff. Some of it he mentioned a lot, and he won the election. But that's if you're a civil rights lawyer or a civil liberties person, that's not the end of the story to you. Suppose Trump had said, I'll pick a whimsical example. I love redheaded people. I love redheaded women, especially. If I'm president, redheads don't have to pay taxes. All right. So there's a constitutional issue right there. The fact that he ran on it wouldn't necessarily be the end of the argument. The courts would have to deal with this. And so the answer, the answer from the liberal lawyers who are suing Trump is that, yes, he's had all the overwhelming number of these decisions go against him because no president's ever done the things he did. And so we should keep that in mind, is that he's going places presidents haven't gone before, or at least in recent years, and he's doing it really quickly. And so, that's the other reason there's all this litigation. He brought this on himself, and I think he welcomes the challenge. He even remember that exchange he got into with the Maine governor. I'll see you in court, right? That's he wants some of these things resolved because as he should.
The flip side of that, though, too, this is something that, again, Sean Davis mentioned. The proper way, like you take these examples of the folks who are being deported, the proper way to go through the court system is to file habeas in the jurisdiction from which they come, not to go sort of judge shopping for a liberal judge in DC or California or whatever to get somebody who's simpatico with the ACLU, whoever's bringing the lawsuit, which is part of the problem. What's been going on, and that's why so many of these decisions, I think, that has to be rectified as well.
Yeah. So just one last thing on this, which is, does this vindicate, though, so far, it's early days, Trump's strategy here of sort of pushing on these things, knowing he's going to get challenged in the courts, but knowing that he's going to ultimately win when it gets to the Supreme Court because it's a Republican court, Carl, as you put it.
Yeah, I think he thinks that, but I'm not sure all the justices do. We saw from Amy Coney Barrett, she's willing to do her own thinking. And when, the MAGA people who previously attacked her critics with vicious terms, then turn on her and attack her and call her a DEI hire, that makes them look terrible. And there are a couple of them up there, maybe more than a couple, who still seem to just weigh the merits of the case, and maybe a majority of them. Certainly John Roberts does that. Now Amy Coney Barrett does that. I think Brett Kavanaugh does that. So the court's in a funny position. If it decides in Trump's favor, people say, "Oh, that's his judges." If it goes against them, "Oh, they're apostates. They lied they betrayed the president." We have to sort of ignore that noise. And when these decisions start going down, and this is incumbent on the people in the press and the media too, to examine the logic of the decision and to weigh it.
Tom, you see it that way, or is this a Republican court that he can count on?
No, I don't think he can fully count on the court for the reasons that Carl mentioned. I mean, there are a couple wild cards on the court that have shown that they will decide against the administration on various issues. So I don't think it's a slam dunk. Obviously, it is a conservative court. There's no question about that. But there is, you do have the liberals on the court who are, I mean, I don't know, they vote pretty much the same way. And then you've got, as Carl mentioned, some the Clarence Thomas and Alito who are pretty solidly conservative in their thinking. So I think Trump thinks the court will ultimately, he will prevail, but it's definitely not a slam dunk.
Okay. So it doesn't sound like anyone wants to add more justice to the court here. I thought I might get someone who wanted to pack the court.
Yeah, that was Biden's. Biden was receptive to that. At first he rejected it, but then he got leaned on, and he sort of made noises like he was receptive to it. But that's for another day. The Democrats probably have to win the Congress and the White House to make that happen, and then maybe then they won't want to do it. Maybe then they'll want to appoint judges.
Well, okay, guys, we're going to have to leave it there. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Tom and Carl, and we'll be back with more right after this. Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Tom Bevan and Carl Cannon. And, guys, every presidential candidate to some degree is a team of rivals. That's the phrase that was used to describe Abraham Lincoln's cabinet. It appears when it comes to this cabinet and Trump's tariffs, there is an internal struggle. It's going on between Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. Tom, Bessent seems to represent the faction that wants tariffs to be used as a tool to bring down trade barriers and make trade deals. Lutnick seems to believe tariffs will drive companies to reshore and restore America's industrial base. So this battle does seem to be happening with the White House. What do you make of it, and who do you think is got the president's ear?
Well, of the two, my opinion is that I've seen Scott Bessent more on television and articulating the president's plan more effectively. I mean, he's actually been really, really good in the places that I've seen him as he's talked about the market and the equities and the income disparities and the like, and how Trump's trying to sort of reorient the system in a more equitable way for working class folks. And, Lutnick hasn't been as good in my opinion, and he's gotten a little bit of bad press. I mean, we saw there's a Wall Street Journal piece out this morning talking about behind closed doors that he's sending mixed signals, and it was not a terribly flattering portrayal of Howard Lutnick. So, and I don't know where that came from, right? You never know the ulterior motives that cause a story like that to end up in the paper. But between the two, I mean, I would say Bessent's the one who's doing the better job articulating the policy, and by virtue of that, probably has more of Trump's ear.
Well, Carl, what do you make of this team of rivalries?
Well, I think Howard Lutnick's behavior is itself drawn negative attention to him. And I don't necessarily see it as a rivalry between he and other cabinet members, but he's sort of led with his chin in a couple of ways. Our friend Juan Williams, who's been on the show, pointed out a statement that in his column this week that Howard Lutnick made. He wants that it was the most tone-deaf moment in recent American politics. Here's in a podcast, here's what the Commerce Secretary said. And I'm going to read you this quote. Remember that the Commerce Secretary is worth over $1 billion. Here's what he said about old people and Social Security. Quote, "If Social Security didn't send their checks out this month, my 94-year-old mother-in-law wouldn't complain. She'd think something got messed up and she'd get it next month. A fraudster always makes the loudest noise, screaming and yelling. Anybody who knows payments knows you stop the checks and whoever screams is the one stealing. Juan pointed out, excuse me, did he just say that anyone complaining about not getting their check is likely a thief? Doesn't reflect well on the Trump administration. And nobody did that to him in the cabinet, no long knives. That's something he did to himself.
Fair enough. But Tom mentioned that Wall Street Journal article and said, where do those things come from? They don't just come out of thin air. There were 12 sources for it, and it was clearly there's a move afoot within the White House, I think, at least among some people, to sort of try to bring Lutnick down a peg or two. That's the way I read it.
I don't dispute that. What I'm saying is there's a reason they're doing that, and I gave you the reason. He's reflecting poorly on the administration.
But, Tom, to this larger point, I guess this is the $1 million question, or the $6 trillion question, which is, what is it? Are we doing these tariffs in order to lower trade barriers and sort of get to zero across the board, which seems to be what Bessent is sort of promising and people like Kevin Hassett talk about? Or are we really trying to sort of keep those barriers up? Because if we do that, according to Lutnick, we'll reshore businesses and we'll make iPhones here again, which is something he said over the weekend.
I think the Trump administration wants to do all of the above with that. Mm-hmm. And look, we'll see how this works out. We talked about this yesterday. I think there's a long game in play here. Now the number is apparently up to 70, the number of countries that are apparently ready and willing to work with the administration on doing some sort of deal on tariffs. China's the biggest competitor and the one who has now vowed that they're going to fight to the end on this, and Trump's retaliating. So that we'll see how that works out. But I think there is not full agreement within the administration on the utility of tariffs and the way that they've been applied and all of those things. I mean, obviously, I think the most glaring example is, Elon Musk was attacking Peter Navarro. Navarro was on TV suggesting that, Elon doesn't really manufacture cars. He only assembles cars, and, he gets all of his parts from overseas. And Elon Musk went on to called him a moron on Twitter, said he was dumb as a bag of bricks or something. I mean, pretty harsh terms. And, Elon's got, I don't know, 120 million followers on X. So it's when he says something, it immediately becomes part of the larger conversation. And so you do have within the administration, I think, a variety of viewpoints and on the issue, not just on the issue of tariffs, but on the way that they're being applied in this instance.
Yeah. Well, I want to switch gears a little bit here and talk about AOC. This is just one of those stories. Apparently, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, back on March 19th, was photographed in the first-class cabin of a JetBlue plane on her way to Vegas to speak at a Bernie Sanders rally entitled Fighting Oligarchy. This, of course, made it on social media, Carl. What do you think of it? And, is it fair to criticize progressives who are just simply tired of flying coach? I mean, can you blame them?
Well, Tom and I were in.
Carl doesn't fly coach. He has no idea what you're talking about.
We're in Phoenix on the way back. On Phoenix a few days ago. Flew back on the weekend. Tom was on a different flight from Richard Porter, who was on the show, and Richard's a big man. Probably 6'2", 230, big, solid, not fat. Well, looks like an athlete, and he was flying in a center seat coach, and I felt really bad because I had upgraded to first class. And I didn't tell Richard that, but I pulled out my thing to see when I was boarding, and he noticed, and he was very kind about it. But look, flying coach in this country has become an ordeal. It's a first world problem, as the young people like to say, but it's a qualitatively different experience to fly up front. And the real reason, in all seriousness, that I try to get upgraded.
We're not attacking you for flying first class.
Well, no, but I can't. Well, I'm going to get back to
first class all you want.
I have this laptop, company bought it for me. I can't get it open in coach. It literally won't open because of the sheet in front of me, and I have to go down like this and look at a screen about 6 inches thick. But in first class, you can open it. So what I'm trying to say is that I assume AOC was flying first class so that she could do the work of the American people in first class and get her laptop open and answer constituents' email and do all that. I am not someone who would laugh at a line like the New York Post had, fighting oligarchs one mimosa at a time.
That was a great line.
I guess I did laugh at that. It's a pretty good line. But, you can work in first class. It's hard to work in coach.
Well, look, I mean, obviously, Carl, you're not fighting the oligarchy. Okay. You haven't promised and vowed to fight the oligarchy. So that's the distinction here. And the hypocrisies, listen, these are avowed socialists. This is, Bernie Sanders owns 3 homes, I believe, right? He's made millions of dollars off of books that he's written and speeches that he's given and all these things, all the while complaining about the capitalist system. AOC, same deal.
Well, I think that's the real hypocrisy there. Not that she threw first class, but they're flying around the country to these Stop the Oligarchs meetings. And, the evidence has trickled out. These rallies are funded by rich Democratic donors. So, a more honest sign would be, our oligarchs are better than your oligarchs. But that's probably not a winning political proposition.
Listen, I don't begrudge you or AOC to have your mimosas in first class all you want. Okay, but don't pretend to be some man of the people or woman of the people. That's not walking the walk.
Well, guys, we're going to have to leave it there. Anyway, you're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I've been talking with Tom and Carl, but don't go away. When we come back, Tom is going to talk to Phil Wegmann, our White House correspondent.
Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Tom Bevan, co-founder and president of RCP. Joined now by Phil Wegmann. He is our White House reporter. Mr. Wegmann, how are you?
Doing well and not checking my retirement portfolio.
That's never look at your 401k, Phil. That's rule number 1. Rule number 2 is never read the comments on anything that you write or post on social media or even this podcast, for example. All right. You are a White House reporter. You were in the White House yesterday doing your job and got called on by the president himself to ask him a couple of questions. He was in the Oval Office, I believe, with Netanyahu, who was visiting. Give our listeners and viewers a sense of what it's like to be in that environment, especially when there's a high-profile dignitary visiting.
So I was in the pool yesterday as the print pool reporter, and during these bilateral meetings between the president and a foreign dignitary, what generally happens is we are invited into the Oval Office. They are there sitting in front of the fireplace, and then 30 or so reporters try and shout questions at the president and get called on. This is always sort of a scrum, but it was particularly chaotic yesterday. Because to set the scene here, at the White House and around the world, the context is uncertainty. Everyone is trying to figure out what these reciprocal tariffs actually mean. And we had a case study sitting next to the president in Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who had announced previously that Israel would be cutting its tariffs to the United States to 0, but that wasn't enough. And there in the Oval Office, Netanyahu, they made some announcements about talks with Iran, but on the trade front, Netanyahu seemed to say that his nation was going to be a model for the rest of the world in doing business with the United States. Not only were they going to be cutting their tariffs to 0, but some of these non-monetary barriers, such as export controls and currency manipulations, all sorts of things that the administration hasn't always defined but have existed, that he was going to be taking care of those as well. But the question that the markets had at this point was whether or not the European Union's offer that was on the table, which was a 0 for 0 deal, where they would cut their tariffs to nothing on consumer goods and vehicles, if that was going to be good enough for Donald Trump. And the president of the United States told RealClearPolitics that no, it is not. He sees the harms of European trade with the United States as not just going back to these last couple of years, but he sees this going back decades, and he wants America to get even.
And what exactly? I mean, I know you asked the question, you answered that no, it wasn't good enough, but what does he want? What is good enough?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question here, because we're figuring this out
didn't
as
elaborate.
we go. He elaborated at length, but it was more about his frustrations with Europe. He's frustrated about the tariffs that have been there for some time, but he's also frustrated about currency manipulation. He's also frustrated about the value added tax. He's frustrated also that the United States has been the security guarantor for Europe for some time, and now that is going to be part of the calculation. We heard that from Caroline Levitt in today's press briefing. But all of this is particularly interesting because, we heard reciprocal tariffs, and that seemed to be all right, 1-to-1. But then there are these questions. You have Peter Navarro out there, his trade advisor, saying that 0 is not enough. All of these other barriers have to go as well. And oh, by the way, these tariffs are going to be permanent. This is not a negotiation. And then going in the other direction, you have Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent saying, oh, no, no, no. These tariffs are the beginning of a negotiation, and in all likelihood, they're not permanent. So that's the type of, cognitive dissonance that is wrapping up the White House right now. They will tell you it's a negotiation in part, but elsewhere, the tariffs are always going to be there. It is a confusing moment for the markets and for all of us here.
And like every good reporter, Phil, you didn't just get one question. Some people ask 2, 3, 4 in their one, but you did get a follow-up with the president. Tell us about it.
So one of the concerns is that, look, the money is going to flow like water, and so are consumer goods. And the question is whether or not some of our former trading partners are going to be spurned and then look for another market. Are they going to draw closer to China? We saw something similar happen with the bad guys, right? We've seen Russia get much closer to China as a result of the Ukraine war. Could we see some of the good guys get closer to China as they look for a market to sell their goods? The president, he sort of hand waved this away, and he said that, these folks are going to want to be in the best hands, which is the United States, not China's. As that trade war between the United States and China heats up, I think that, this is going to be a concern for them because, these businesses, they have obligations. They have to meet their bottom line as well. But the president, he was not concerned about that yesterday in the Oval Office.
You're lucky he didn't call the question stupid like he did that reporter on Air Force One the other day.
Well, but one other thing here that I think I've been trying to think through, right? As we have economists, and we have these formulas that are sometimes, inconsistently applied. What I think is a good sort of lens to understand why Donald Trump is not terrified by the market dipping is that he sees these tariffs in a social justice light. Now, obviously, he wouldn't describe them that way, but if you listen to the comments that Scott Bessent made in his interview with Tucker Carlson, where he points out that last year set a record of the most Americans going to Europe for vacations, and also the most Americans also going to food banks. But then also, you cross-reference that with, Megyn Kelly saying, hey, the top 90% is owned by the top 10%, right? There is this sense that it's not just about what makes most sense when it comes down to dollars and cents. It's this administration, they think that they're doing something that's good, not just for the coasts, but for the middle of the country. And that's quite different from the, trickle down economics that we're used to, from the Republican Party.
Yeah. I also saw, I think it was David Marcus from Fox News who had made the comment that, the Democrats have said for the last couple of weeks, their whole argument has been that, Trump's his sole existence in the White House was to make his billionaire buddies, even more rich. And now they're losing money hand over fist in the markets as $6 trillion evaporates. So Democrats are going to have to come up with a new talking point.
We got to do a wellness check on Bill Ackman. His portfolio is suffering.
All right. Shifting gears, Phil, we also ran a story of yours at the top of the site this morning. You profiled Senator Eric Schmitt. I had him on the program a couple of weeks ago when right after the hearings took place, or actually this was before the hearings took place. This is, I think it's the second round of censorship hearings, but give our listeners a sense of what he was like, and obviously he's very much focused on the censorship complex. He's been focused on it since he was the Attorney General of Missouri. Now he's the junior senator from the Show Me State.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting here because before the Twitter files, before we could get a peek at how the Biden administration was dealing with Twitter, and also, how some of these government agencies were dealing with Twitter in the run up to the 2020 election, before Jen Psaki at the White House podium told us Real Clear Politics about how she was working with with Facebook to flag problematic posts before any number of these things came to light. It was Schmidt who, through that lawsuit, Missouri v. Biden, was able to win discovery and start to peel back the curtain for how the administration was dealing with these social media companies. That was sort of the tip of the spear here. And he lost at the Supreme Court later in 2023 because of a standing issue. But Schmidt is, really the one who has been ringing the bell on this for some time, trying to bring light to what he sees as censorship, not just directly from the executive, but also what conservatives see as censorship with extra steps, where you have these non-government organizations, working with third parties to pressure platforms and other organizations. And my big takeaway from this story is that here you have Eric Schmidt, 4 years removed from the pandemic. It's over, but it's not forgotten. And there were all of these conversations about, hey, there were mistakes that were made during the pandemic and that there should be some sort of amnesty. That's how the Atlantic magazine put it. Well, when it comes to free speech, Eric Schmidt's answer is hell no. He sees sort of a censorship industrial complex, something that Democrats do not believe exists, as having gone underground, and he wants to root it out so long as Republicans are in control.
I was going to ask you about that because one of the things Democrats, they simply don't think that that it existed. And I wonder why they think that. Is that like willful ignorance? Because clearly, if you just take the most egregious example, the New York Post being locked out of social media accounts, and that whole story about the Hunter Biden laptop being, everybody sort of Facebook and all the social media folks, right? They wouldn't circulate it. They de-emphasized it. Again, anybody who mentioned it, you mentioned in the story, I think one of the political reporters retweeted it and he got suspended. It was literally locked down. You couldn't. So that's an example of it right there. But Democrats sort of, how do they dismiss that example? They just say it was a one-off thing, or?
Yeah, the third largest newspaper in the United States suddenly being censored by Twitter. And then what we later learned is you had the FBI and other agencies warning that this information from the Hunter Biden laptop could be part of a hack and leak operation. The question that you're raising is the one that Peter Welch, Democrat from Vermont, sort of asked during the committee hearing. He said, censorship industrial complex that benefits Democrats. I'm a Democrat. You give us too much credit. But the answer from Schmidt and others is that this has become so much of an institution that no, lawmakers themselves don't have to be the ones who are directing it. Instead, they just have to keep the money flowing. And time after time, if you look at some of these non-governmental organizations, whether it's NewsGuard or the Global Disinformation Index or the Aspen Institute, there's a common thread, which is that they're all generally liberal. And during the last half decade, at least, they all were of the opinion that, Donald Trump was an existential threat to democracy, and they all got U.S. taxpayer dollars.
I was just going to say, I was going to do my Biden whisper, and they all got U.S. taxpayer dollars. All right. We will have to leave it there. Phil Wegmann, White House reporter for Real Clear Politics. Phil, always good to have you. Thanks.
Thanks, sir.
All right. We're going to take another quick break. We'll be back with more Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM after this.
Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth, and my next guest is Homi Kharas. He is Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institute. He is also a former Chief Economist at the World Bank, and he's the author of The Rise of the Global Middle Class, How the Search for the Good Life Can Change the World. So, Homi, welcome back to the program.
So much for having me again, Andy.
So Homi, I wanted to talk to you today, especially because I am interested in the geopolitics of the trade battle that's going on right now. It seems that wherever you stand on Trump's tariffs, they do signal a change in the relationship between America and the rest of the world. It goes beyond economics. So I wanted to talk to you. Let's start with Asia. There are these developing countries like Vietnam, the Philippines, maybe you put Taiwan in a separate case, but these are countries that have built their modern economies around exporting to the United States. So how would a change in tariffs affect our political relationships with these allies, really?
Really interesting because for a long time, the US has been trying to pivot towards Asia. And that was an explicit part of several presidents' strategies to try to combat Chinese influence in the region. And countries like Vietnam have a bilateral free trade agreement with the US. So there was this real effort to say, look, come rely on us. We are a reliable partner. We've got these massive open markets where you can trade, and it can really help your prosperity. And many of these countries kind of jumped onto that bandwagon and have done very well. And I'm sure they're now a little bit taken aback that they're being hit with these kinds of tariffs, because it will make them rethink what their strategies are. They've always had what I would call hedge strategies.
Mm-hmm.
They want to have good in Southeast Asia, in ASEAN countries. They want to have good relations both with the US and with China. They don't want to be choosing one or the other. But certainly these tariffs are going to change that kind of conversation.
Yeah, there was this interesting piece in the Wall Street Journal, I think it ran on Monday, about Vietnam in particular. And the reporter sort of goes into the idea or the fact that on the ground there, Americans are very popular. There's so much business back and forth. And it is a form of soft power, isn't it? I mean, it's not just pure economics. It puts people in front of one another. It knits your interests together. And that really, in your book about the growth of the global middle class, that sort of comes through, the idea that basically by this trade regime we've had for the last 30 years or so has really been the engine which has sort of knit the world together and sort of got all these people out of poverty and into what we would call a middle class lifestyle.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't like to call it soft power, because power to me means you're kind of trying to force people to do something that maybe they don't want to do. Actually, it's more just
That's
values.
diplomacy.
It's values. If you think of what kind of a world do we want, I think the answer is, wouldn't it be great if we had a world where many countries and many people were in the middle class? And that, to some extent, is what we have. And actually, ironically, one of the things that I talk about in my book is that the first political act of the middle class was to repeal tariffs in Victorian England.
Wow, interesting.
Because the middle class, basically, they want the cheapest goods for them to consume. They hate inflation. It erodes their savings. And what are we getting now? We're getting tariffs, and we'll almost certainly get some price increases, and savings will be eroded, not just because markets are falling, but also because prices are going up. So not only is it going to affect the US middle class, but it's also going to affect the middle class in many of these Asian countries. And then the question is, what do we expect them to do?
Yeah, well, that is my question. I mean, and when we talk about a hedge strategy, I think that's an interesting way to put it. But just going back to Vietnam as an example, or the Philippines for that matter, they are not big fans of China. They've had in terms of, when they look at their geopolitical situation, China's right on the doorstep there. So how realistic is it that they would be driven back into China's orbit in some way, the way they were, or at least Vietnam was back in the 50s and 60s, I guess.
So look, I mean, China and Vietnam have even fought a war in my memory.
Right.
And obviously they have competing claims over different parts of the South China Sea and over the resources that are in those waters. But ultimately, I think, East Asians are very pragmatic, and they will do deals, but they want stability, and they want an assurance that once they do a deal, that it'll stay. And these days, when you're talking about making an investment in, something significant, these are long duration things. We're not really talking about somebody putting up a garment factory where you can, actually you can build it in 6 months and make your money and, exit 3 years later and you've already made your money. If you're doing something more substantial, then you need these relationships to be to last longer. So I think, yes, I think that you will have, there are already deals with China. There is a regional cooperation agreement in the Pacific. You remember the old Trans-Pacific Partnership that President Obama initiated, but then the U.S. did not ultimately join. But several of these kinds of things are emerging, and I'm sure we'll get more regional trade agreements just to put some stability back into the system.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about Europe for a second then, because this is part of a larger pattern of America sort of withdrawing from Europe. I mean, they were already worried about our security agreement with NATO. They were looking at what we're doing in Ukraine, and then on top of that, possible trade war. Is there a silver lining here at all in that Europe might get its act together and pay for its own defenses and reinvest in its own economy, as opposed to relying on the United States?
Oh, I think unquestionably they're moving in that direction. And, there are many people who have quipped that President Trump has done something that the Europeans have not been able to do for the last 50 years, which is to bring Europe together. And maybe, even things like Brexit now will kind of be, to a certain degree, reversed as people start to think about new arrangements between the UK and Europe. So I think that there'll be some positives in the Europeans becoming a little bit more aware of their need to basically look after themselves. But unfortunately, it's come at a bit of a cost. And, Europe and the US are still the two largest blocks in the world. And if they could trade amongst each other, there would be tremendous benefits for both parties.
Well, we got about a minute left here, Homi. I did want to ask you sort of where you see this going, because it seems to be there's two paths, or at least that's what people are talking about. And it's two sides of the administration. It's two sides of Trump's brain, it looks like. I mean, the 70 countries or so, it sounds like, according to the White House, are trying to renegotiate the deals. Trump loves to negotiate. He loves deals. At the same time, he loves tariffs. Where do you think they're going to end up?
That's a really good question. I think that, one of the things that I think people need to understand is that the tariffs are not a tool that will actually address the fundamental problem that the president is talking about, which is to reduce the US's current account deficit and bring manufacturing back to this country. Tariffs won't do that. They will shift, I'm sure, production from, let's say, Vietnam to Mexico.
Right.
But actually, almost everything that the US imports, it's third parties competing amongst themselves for their share of the US, not competing against US firms. There are a few exceptions, like in cars, etc., but the vast bulk is not. So tariffs won't solve the trade deficit. And I think that's right now a little bit. I don't know if it's a miscalculation, but people have to recognize that the industrial policy part of this is a completely separate requires a completely separate set of instruments,
Right.
and those as yet haven't been put on the table.
Right. Well, we're going to have to leave it there, Homi. Unfortunately, I'd love to talk more about this. We'll have to have you back soon. I've been listening. I've been talking to Homi Kharas. He's at the Brookings Institute. You've been listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. On behalf of Tom, Carl, all of us at RCP, thank you for listening. Have a great evening, and we'll see you back here tomorrow.